Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. It's the morning after the night before, a Labour landslide here in the UK. We are looking at 412 Labour MPs, down to only 121 Tory MPs. It's a majority of 174. There are 2 seats left to count. Rishi Sunak, the Tory Prime Minister, has already conceded. He's already given his speech. He's on his way right now to Buckingham Palace. And by the time this video goes out, no doubt we will already have Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Yet all is not what it seems. The headline number appears to be a huge change, a sea change in public opinion about politics. But look under the surface, and this victory is a very shallow one. And what we want to do in the next half hour with Tom McTague, our very own political editor, is to dig into those numbers and try, also with his knowledge of what's been going on inside the Labour campaign, try to unpick what's actually happening. Because the front pages, which will be there for the next couple of days, are going to tell one story, and the truth, or what is significant about this election, is maybe slightly different. So, Tom, let's just start by going through what the results actually are. As I just said, Labour has 412 seats, Conservatives 121. The Liberal Democrats have surged to 71 seats. And the big surprise is that Reform UK even has a few seats. It was originally predicted last night that it would have been 13. It turns out it's only going to be 4. And yet all of this is on the most slender of vote shares. Mm-hmm. And we just did a few little calculations just before we started filming. For example, if you tally the votes that Labour has received in the past 3 elections, Corbyn, Starmer, it's fewer. 2017, he received 12,887,000 votes, Jeremy Corbyn. 2019, 10,269,000 votes. 2024, Keir Starmer, landslide victory with huge majority, 9,686,000. So what is going on there? How has this actually happened?
Well, I think when you look back to those results in 2017 and 2019, they were this kind of existential battle for control of post-Brexit Britain. And so the main parties came together into these giant blocks of voters who were voting on one side or another. And actually the 2017 election then proved indecisive. And so then it all came down to 2019. You had to choose one way or the other which one you were going to do. You had to take responsibility. Were you going to have Brexit, or were you going to have Jeremy Corbyn? And so you had people who were uncomfortable with both, but choosing one way or the other. This time it's been completely different. And it's almost into a more European electoral count in the end, where the main parties are splitting. We see this all across Europe, where you have had these big blocks on the centre-left and the centre-right, which have fragmented to the far left and the far right and the centre and all types of parties. And the main parties have just not got anywhere near as much support as they once did. And that seems to be what's happening here, but on speed. We've never seen something like this before. Let's have a look at the Labour Party result. This 33.7%. I mean, that's
the vote share.
That's the vote share.
We need to underline that. So 33.7% of the people who chose to vote voted Labour. And it looks like the turnout is down from 69% previous general election to 60%. Yeah. So you can put 60% of 33.7%, and it's going to take you down to 20-ish. 1 in 5 people voted Labour. And here they are with an overwhelming majority. It will strike a lot of people as a strange kind of system, and you feel like questions of the voting system are now going to come back to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly, if we are moving in this direction of having a European system of parties, but we actually still have the first past the post, that's going to be very difficult to maintain. I mean, if you have a look at Reform, for instance, Reform won 4 million votes. Just over 4 million votes, and they got 4 MPs. So it took 1 million people per MP for Reform.
Well, let's look at the Liberal Democrats next to Reform. I feel like if we want to really underline that contrast, for over 4 million votes for 4 MPs, for reform. Liberal Democrats, 3.5 million, almost exactly, 3,499,000 so far. We should say there are 2 seats left to count. It won't make a huge amount of difference. Total seats, 71.
Yes.
They will say, and I've already seen Liberal Democrats on the air this morning and late last night defending that and saying, well, hilariously, they are in favour of proportional representation. They think the voting system is unfair, and yet they're now real beneficiaries of it. But their argument is, look, as long as this is the system, we should be playing the game. We want to have as many MPs in Parliament as possible. So they have these very localised, very clever, targeted campaigns that are very much about specific constituencies over long periods of time, and they're very good at it. That's the Lib Dems' kind of secret sauce.
I mean, I think that's a reasonable argument. I mean, they're going to butt up against this problem that if they want to change the electoral system, they're going to have to go into an alliance with Nigel Farage. They're going to have to hold their nose and do the deal with him. And that's the way that you convince, that's the lessons of previous referendums. To convince the public, you have to build a broad coalition of left and right. And actually, the progressives have been terrible at that. Liberal Democrats lost the AV referendum in 2011 to try and change the electoral system to benefit them more. But they wouldn't form these coalitions necessary. But right now, they're reaping the rewards. I mean, I think we have to say there's kind of a brutal efficiency about the British electoral system. People understand it, and they're voting based on the choices that they have in front of them. So, you know, it's not like this would just translate directly into a system if we had PR. I think it would be markedly different. I mean, I think Reform, though, would likely still do well. They, you know, something along these kind of lines. Whether the other parties would fare the same, I'm not sure.
That's an interesting distinction, actually, because you feel like that a lot of the votes that went Lib Dem are more tactical, more strategic. Yeah. They're voting against the Tories because they know that Lib Dems are strong in that constituency and they're the people most. So they rally behind the Liberal Democrat in a specific constituency to get the Tories out.
Yes.
You do not feel that those Lib Dem 3.5 million voters are enormously impassioned about their particular policies on sewage in lakes or, you know, whatever the green agenda the Lib Dems are pushing. You don't feel like it's a policy platform. It's strategic.
And they've had this for a long time. They've for a while, in fact, they even managed to take on board a lot of Eurosceptic voters as a protest vote, even though they were the most pro-European party. They did so after the Iraq War as well, and students before tripling tuition fees. So they have been traditionally a party of a protest vote. You know, we've characterised them as a left-wing party, and they are a left-wing party. But then if you have a look at the electoral map here and see where they're winning.
It's very much the southwest. That's their traditional heartland. They call it the A30 corridor, basically the road that goes from London all the way down to Penzance.
Yeah.
That's where, if you want to meet Lib Dems, drive along that road. But there are other pockets.
Yeah, I mean, just look at this, right? Whitney. They've won in Whitney. This was David Cameron's seat. This was as safe as you can get. This is about as pleasant and nice a Tory kind of place in England as you're possibly going to imagine. This is Cotswold country. They've won in
they won in
Newbury.
Bicester.
Yeah.
So right next to Whitney, and in fact part of Bicester was in David Cameron's old constituency. And the candidate there was Rupert Harrison for the Conservatives, who was a very well-known, very well-respected potential future star of the Tories. You know, he was very brilliant. He was in charge of the Treasury during the Osborne-Cameron years, and a lot of people thought if he had come into Parliament, he would have been an instant bet for the kind of shadow Treasury or shadow Chancellor, and yet he lost to the Liberal Democrat in Bicester. And so I think the words you just used there, which is saying pleasant, nice constituency, that's the Lib Dems kind of brand, isn't it?
Social democracy for the shires, for the middle classes, right? That's what they are. Are they left-wing, or are they a kind of, I don't know, more progressive, more liberal Tory, effectively? Look where else they've won. Maidenhead. This was Theresa May's seat. Henley. This is Boris Johnson's seat. This is all going.
And if you count Liz Truss in Norfolk, that went Lib Dem.
Yeah.
So in fact, 5 Tory Prime Minister's seats are now Lib Dem seats.
Absolutely, and places down in the south, Tunbridge Wells has fallen for the first time in history. to the Liberal Democrats. It's always been a Conservative seat. And so this is the kind of thing that's happening in the country.
Just to understand that, I think that is quite an important thing to get your head around, because in a way, I think the story that we will be reading about in the papers for the next few days and that will be on the airwaves will be about reform and the Tory collapse and the Labour victory. But actually, the Lib Dems are not really a sideshow in this. They've won a huge number of seats. They've gone up 60 from under 10 to 70 plus seats. And it is, as you say, it's a kind of affluent, potentially market-friendly kind of voter who wants to be a bit green and, most importantly, feels like they want to be a good guy. Nice, gentle. They don't like the sort of populist talk. They don't like too much sort of rhetoric around immigration. They want to be the nice guys. That's how they would see themselves. And Lib Dems have offered themselves with these kind of maybe slightly vacuous but nice alternative to the Tories. And they're doing pretty well.
Well, 70 seats is a big deal. So if you think that effectively these are all of the seats that David Cameron won. So if you add 70 seats to their tally, that's effectively what he would have cleaned up. But it still doesn't take you anywhere near enough. And this is the real problem for the Tories, isn't it? How on earth do you win back all of those Liberal seats and win back the seats that you have just given up after one term that have now either gone to the Labour Party or they've gone to Reform? And if they've gone to the Labour Party, Reform are in second place. So the Tories have lost all across the north, across the northeast. But again, if you're looking at the map, what you notice is once upon a time, most of the map, if it was made up geographically, would be blue because the Tories win in rural areas, which are bigger constituencies. And the Labour areas are in these urban corridors. So you have the northwest, London, and then the central belt up in Scotland. And this is what Labour has rebuilt. And so they've completely dominated in Scotland, in the areas where people live. They're completely dominant in the northwest, all the way stretching over into Yorkshire, and they're dominant in London. I mean, London is just a one-party state now.
Except the little island of independence in Islington North.
Oh, yes.
Let's not forget Jeremy Corbyn. We'll come back to him perhaps.
Yeah, and indeed, the Tories managed to hold on in Ian Duncan Smith's seat, and that was because of a challenge again from the left, which split the progressive vote. This is, I think, like a fundamental conundrum for the next Tory leader. How do you build a coalition that wins both of those people back into the Tory party? Now, the way that they've done it previously is they've set themselves up as the only way to stop something else that's bad. So they stop Jeremy Corbyn, stop the SNP dominating the Labour Party, stop Gordon Brown, stop something you don't like. And people have then held their nose and said, OK, I'll vote for the Tory party because at least they govern competently. That's gone. They can't. They're going to take a long time, I think, to rub away this stain of the last 5 years. I don't know when people are going to start thinking that again, that they are the competent people that at least you can trust. They might not be very nice, but at least you can trust them to kind of run things.
So it was this sort of common sense
party.
Brand value.
Yeah. And so then you have Reform. And it feels to me during this election that they were the one party with a kind of insurgent energy.
I mean, no doubt.
No doubt. And Nigel Farage was the one person with the biggest personality in this campaign. I mean,
the only personality, perhaps.
I think so. He's going to have challenges now. Now, see, he owns this party that he
literally,
he
well,
literally
as
owns.
You, I think, uncovered in a piece for us. It's a company, not a not-for-profit, not a political party technically, and most of the shares are owned by N. Farage.
Absolutely.
So he literally owns it.
It seems to me that another problem for the Tories is that Reform seems to fit with today's divide more clearly, more obviously, more naturally in a way than the Conservative Party. They know what they are, Reform. They know what they stand for and what they're offering. And then they don't have to kind of, qualify their statements to try and build this broader coalition that's more contradictory. They just sort of say, this is it. We know who we want to vote for us.
And that in itself, in a way, even if you're not signed up to the whole platform, And there may well be reform voters who maybe disagree with Farage on economics or on some other things. You know, he himself is an interesting combination of instincts, but the very fact that he's clear about what he thinks and is confident is itself very attractive, I think, in a time of such confusion when nobody seems to know, there's no conviction anywhere, and all these parties seem to be kind of slicing and dicing everything and not saying anything and sounding like politicians. He just says, this is what I believe, this is what I want to do, and that's unusual.
I was on the BBC during the campaign, and there was some talk about how his statement on Russia and how the EU and the West had provoked Russia into its invasion of Ukraine would damage him. And I sort of recalled that in 2017, when Corbyn had made similar statements, it didn't damage him at all. People have some kind of respect for somebody who never backs down. And I think it's almost like they think, I spend my life having to watch what I say and back down and fearful that I'm going to be, cancelled or criticised if I trip up. Here's a guy who never backs down. He's kind of, and so there is this psychological element to this where they
think it, quite understandably, they think it looks like leadership.
They look
conviction.
Bravery, that's how a lot of people will see it. So I don't think, even if they disagree with him on these things, they probably don't mind it.
It is true that he perhaps has learnt from Donald Trump. There's a lot of negative speculation about their relationship, and Nigel Farage is in there to make money, or he's going to go and campaign for him, or whatever. But the thing Donald Trump has taught everybody, and it may not be a very happy lesson, but it seems to be very effective, is, as you say, never apologise, never explain, always double down. Whatever they throw at you, embrace it, throw it right back at whoever your opponents are. And all of these meek, apologetic, traditional politicians, Rishi Sunak must have apologised 10 times during this election campaign. He apologised for having left the ceremonies in France early. He then apologised for something that one of his candidates had said. And he literally just apologised 5 minutes ago for having screwed up the election.
Yeah.
You know, apologies, people are fed up with apologies. They don't like apologies. It's not what they want their leaders to do. They want people to lead.
The country was clear that the Tories needed to go. And so they voted for parties that were going to get rid of them. As you were saying with the Lib Dems, people voted to get rid of the Tories there. They voted Reform, where Reform could win, on the coastal seats. And they voted Labour in everywhere where Labour were going to win. So it's an incredibly efficient system for punishing the government, and that's what the country has done. And that's clearly, as well, what the Conservative Party deserves with, what are they on, 24%. I mean, that's just the worst result for a governing party in history. You know, it's just appalling what they've managed to do in 5 years.
Labour's vote share overall is roughly the same as the last two elections. It's plus or minus 1 or 1.5%. But if you exclude Scotland and you just look at England, it's slightly down on previous elections, even on 2019, and it's dramatically down on 2017. So there is no sense in which more people, either by number or vote share, have moved to Labour. The number of Tory seats that have been lost, in most of those, the Reform share of the vote exceeds the amount that the Tories would need to retain them.
Yeah.
So most of the Tory losses can be explained by movement to Reform, or at least if those Reform voters had voted Tory, they would have still won them. And as we said before, Keir Starmer net won fewer votes than Jeremy Corbyn. So it's movement under the hood. It's not a vote for, it's a vote against. This what we've just seen is the tactical defenestration of a hated government. Has it even told us anything more than that, do you think?
Somebody described it last night as like a transfer of power, you know, from one group of people who can't organise themselves to administer that power to another group who look like they can, but are not offering anything radically different. Interestingly, in Scotland as well, Labour have benefited enormously from the fact that the incumbents there were the SNP. And so you also have this other thing going on, and this is something we have to weigh up, and the Labour Party will have to weigh up. Incumbents around the world are losing, and losing badly. whether they are, centrists like Macron, or whether they are social democrats and quite sort of boring, like Scholz in Germany, who's almost, very similar to Keir Starmer, or Biden in the States, but also the SNP in Scotland. So, if you're an incumbent, you're getting beaten. So things came together very nicely for the Labour Party. They could win in England by defeating the Tories and win in Scotland by defeating the SNP. And together that is enough to win this.
So it's a very precarious kind of victory, really. It feels like, from what you're saying, they are the happy recipients of a collection of factors and a bundle of luck in a way, that this, almost like musical chairs, people wanted the Tories out. Labour happened to be the people who sort of benefited from it on this cycle. Their strategy, as you said, was very negative. It was about closing off risk factors, possible attack lines that they knew were unpopular. So, as you mentioned, they moved on gender, this controversial question about trans women and bathrooms and all of that. They've sort of shut that off by becoming more conservative on that. They've become more conservative on tax and spend, lots of promises. We're not going to raise income tax. We're not going to raise capital gains tax. They've
moved on Brexit, for instance. So towards the end of the campaign, Keir Starmer was going even further on Brexit than he had done before, when he'd said, I'm not reopening that question, we're not going to go back in, we're not going to join the single market or the customs union. He goes further and says, I can't imagine a situation where we'll rejoin the EU in my lifetime. On the one hand, you're clearly right that there's a fragility to this Labour coalition. But at the same time, the opposition is so fractured that let's imagine a situation in 5 years' time when they're coming up for re-election, and you have the Liberal Democrats doing well among people who would like a closer relationship with the EU and are frustrated that Labour have done nothing on that, and so they siphon votes off that way. Labour can't possibly move any further because of all of these reform voters, reform candidates who sit in second place across swathes of the country now, holding Labour's feet to the fire. None of those northern MPs are going to support getting closer to the EU.
So they're stuck on that issue.
So they're stuck on that issue, but they won't. Will they be able to go far enough to win over reform voters? Hard to see. So they might start losing votes there. But in a sense, does that matter to the Labour Party if they lose 20 votes to reform, 20 seats to reform, 20 seats to Lib Dems, 20 seats to the Tories, 20 seats to the SNP? Their majority goes down, but they're still the largest party. And so you're into this world of like a fractured European-style system where coalitions are going to be required. Right now, that's not the case, though. We've got 5 years of a big Labour majority. Its challenge is going to be, how on earth do you actually govern with the conditions that they have inherited?
Well, they have a big majority, so you would expect governing to be relatively easy. I mean, in our country, under our constitution, if you, by whatever means, get a big parliamentary majority, you're kind of all powerful. There's nothing stopping you doing whatever you want.
You're not powerful, though, on small boats. You can't do anything about the fact that there are smugglers there on the beaches near Calais. What's Labour's policy going to be there? What's Labour's policy going to be on European Court of Human Rights? We know it's going to be, but that's going to cause them difficulty. That will surely be Nigel Farage's trump card. Will be just leave the ECHR. That will be also presumably a good number of the Tory party leadership candidates. They will promise that. So there are lots of things where the Labour Party is going to be pulling levers, and
but
things
also
won't work.
on the biggest one of all, which is tax and spend and money, they're not all powerful, in that we've seen who's really in charge of government spending plans, which is the bond markets for heavily indebted governments. And when Liz Truss tried to do something radical, the bond market said, no, you're not going to do that. And that was the end of her. That lesson has been very deeply learnt by all parties now, and all across Europe, I think. We see Marine Le Pen referring to Liz Truss.
Yes.
So no one's going to try anything very dramatic in terms of changing the tax and spend calculations or suddenly trying to borrow more money. So actually, in a way, although he's all-powerful arithmetically, and in terms of passing laws, there's not that much that he can do to address the big problems facing the country.
He has got some fundamental problems. That how is he going to reduce immigration? How is he going to deal with the waiting lists in the NHS while not increasing taxes? And how is he going to get growth up? If you look back through Labour's history, there's no guarantee that the unions are going to go softer on the Labour Party than they are on the Conservatives. In many respects, the unions say, we knuckled down during this election. We didn't, kick up a stink by the fact that you've moved into the centre. We want something for the fact that we are linked to you.
100%. They are now going to get their payday. That's how they will think of it. They've waited 14 years patiently dealing with various Tory-led governments. Even on the nurses' strike, which we've talked about, Wes Streeting, who is the Labour minister who will be in charge of that, has said on day one, I will pick up the phone to the nurses union and we'll have a conversation. He said that during the campaign. So all of those unions are now going to be thinking, right, they've got a big majority, they can do what they want. We want pay rises, we want more. And they're going to have a really tough time.
You've got baked in kind of structural challenges. And then there is this great question. When you speak to Tony Blair, and you speak to, or people who are close to him, and you speak to people in the Conservative government, any of the ones that have just gone, Boris Johnson's, Liz Truss's, or Rishi Sunak's, and they all say that the state doesn't function. That you get into power and you pull levers and nothing works. And Tony Blair says, it took him effectively until his third term before he was really on top of it. And by that time, he was on his way out. So there is this, the horseshoe effect between Tony Blair and Dominic Cummings, who both effectively agree that the state doesn't work and needs completely upgrading. And that's why, in Cummings' view, you'll always see now the army being deployed. So there's a flood, send in the army. G4S couldn't man the Olympics, send in the army. That's our go-to. Or call Cobra, the emergency response unit. And people say, oh, that's good, that's the state working. No, that's the state not functioning. You shouldn't have to call Cobra all the time or send in the army to, fill up some sandbags. That should just be like a core part of the, local government doing its job. And so I think that is an interesting question now, to see whether the Labour Party can get this machine to actually function, to do what it wants to do.
And normally that takes money. That's the thing. And you see all these young MPs who are now going to get this first chance of government, full of hope and energy that they are going to break the back of all these problems, and they're going to magically do it without spending more money. And it's just going to be very, very difficult. So for me, the sort of concluding picture is that although it looks like Britain is going in the opposite direction to Europe, and superficially, just when Europe is electing it or voting in big numbers for hard right parties, what does the UK do? It goes soft left Labour. Isn't that a funny contrast? Yeah, in a way. But actually, as you've just explained, look beneath the surface, and it's really quite similar to what's happening in France and Italy and these other European countries, which is fracturing groups of voters, dissatisfied with the establishment, dissatisfied with establishment parties, including the Labour Party, hemmed in by big picture, practical constraints that are frustrating and no one seems to have answers to, like where's the productivity, where's the money coming from, how do we get these machines of government to actually be efficient? No one really has worked that out. And it's a sort of sclerotic, frustrated picture in these governments. So actually the next 5 years are not going to be this dreamy period of akin to 1997 when Tony Blair won, of Labour sort of enjoying itself, finally getting a chance to impose its vision for the future. It's going to be more of this very slow and frustrating kind of grind that quite possibly will just see more and more populist energy. You could find that Nigel Farage character that you were talking about with his personality and conviction continuing to build more and more support during this period. And there may be others, and Keir Starmer's not going to have such a great time of it.
Yeah, you can see the volatility now is just far greater than it's ever been. In terms of the swings are far greater. So the previous elections, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it took a swing of 5% or something to replace one government with the other. Now we're seeing swings of 15, 20%, as this vast group of voters in the middle are basically not aligned with any one tribe or the other. So at each election, they're up for grabs again.
all of the kind of established structures that you think have provided for a successful Western liberal democracy are looking very brittle. And if you have en masse voters that are almost sort of changing their minds with each election, unhappy with whatever they're given, not getting the answers they want, restive, the atmosphere is still there for a lot of chaos to come.
It's chaos, but it's also the other problem is stasis, isn't it? So you have the chaos exists because people think that nothing matters, that nothing ever changes anyway. So it's kind of political chaos and just social continuity. Just nothing much changes. We get, slightly richer if we're lucky, but economic growth is effectively slowing over time. I think there are moments in history that we can look back to and think that something similar has existed. In the 70s, Keir Starmer's hero is Harold Wilson, and he actually finished his time in government a broken man. He could barely get through the day. He couldn't even go for a walk in Chequers because he was so broken by this, drinking during the day. He didn't know how to fix the state. He lost that ability to do it. You could see that kind of feeling with Rishi Sunak. He'd almost just given up. He threw his hands up in the air and thought, I'll just call the election. I can't go on. That's one sort of pessimistic future. But there are times when the state manages to assert itself again. I do think there's this potential irony of Keir Starmer saving Brexit by reimposing some kind of state capacity in Britain. That the British state can control its borders, that it can do things, it can improve the hospitals. I mean, that's the task, right? That's what he has got to do. If he fails, then voters will go and look elsewhere for somebody else who can fix it, perhaps with more extreme solutions.
The more optimistic scenario then, if we want to leave people with that, is how does it work out well? I suppose one thing that could happen is that the stability sort of bonus is real, and that the international community looks very kind of happily on Keir Starmer-led the UK. There's inward investment. Other countries are keen to help. Maybe France is a bit more helpful on migrants than they were with Rishi Sunak, and that you see that tailing off through good cooperation. You could see inward investment from other countries, green things. They could have lots of sort of good news stories to tell in that regard, do you think? What else could go well for him?
Yeah, so I think the bond markets, there's plenty of stories out there that are suggesting that the bond markets would allow Rachel Reeves to borrow as much as Liz Truss did, but they wouldn't let Liz Truss do because they effectively trust this Labour government. That feels quite awkward and wrong, but that may be true.
Why is that awkward and wrong? It's because it's the politicisation of the bond markets. It's sort of government from the international big money.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's odd to see the left cheering the bond markets taking down a government. Yeah. At the same time, if you get yourself into a position where you need to borrow somebody else's money just to function, well then, you aren't powerful anymore. And I've talked about this being our Suez moment. That this is the moment where, we pulled the curtain back and go, oh God, we're not actually powerful enough. The bond markets have just told us how weak we are. And now we have to sort of live with that knowledge, in the same way we live with the knowledge of Suez, that we couldn't act independently of the United States. This is what's happened, and this is the sort of the backdrop for the Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer takeover.
That's true of all European countries, at least anyway. And we mentioned Giorgia Meloni. She's very conscious of reliance on bond markets and the rest of it, and Marine Le Pen as well. So
it's only the United States.
We all live in that reality, apart from the United States.
Absolutely. So perhaps they will have more flexibility. I think there is also this, make Britain boring again. That's what Keir Starmer has done. We've become the dull country. So all of the political crisis moves to Europe. Everybody fixates on Europe. They fixate on France. They and the battle between Marine Le Pen and Emmanuel Macron. They look at Germany and the AfD or Meloni or all of that. And we become boring. And voters look at Europe and go, That looks quite chaotic. Actually, I didn't support Brexit, but let's just stick with what we've got. Let's not upset the apple cart here. And then you get...
And for boring, another word for that is stable.
Yeah.
And, say what you like, that Keir Starmer is that. Remarkably boring/stable, depending on how you look at it.
Rishi Sunak was a boring managerial technocrat who looked like he could do things well. And he put aside the Truss problems and the Boris problems, and he was a good man with, good morals and nice family, all of that. He ended up a broken man because politics is not about being a businessman or being a boring civil servant, a bureaucrat. You have to talk to people. You have to persuade them of your message, what you're trying to do. You have to say to people, somebody's going to lose here with these reforms. And this is why they're losing. This is why you're going to suffer this pain. Margaret Thatcher did it. And the people who suffered the pain didn't vote for her, but there are enough people who didn't suffer the pain who thought it was worth it. And so that's the skill of a politician.
There are no politicians, with the possible exception of Farage, who have those communication skills at the moment. And that must be our sort of tempering thought that, yes, there are scenarios in which it goes surprisingly well for a Keir Starmer Labour government. We've just sort of detailed some of them. But at its heart, as a character, he is very uninspiring. And even his victory speech that we were listening to this morning, it's for someone who's just won a massive majority, he could barely crack a smile. There's a tightness and a intrinsic blandness to Keir Starmer, which is really quite extreme and repels quite a lot of people.
Tony Blair started up at 40-odd% and it shrunk, to 35% by 2005. So he's got to be careful to maintain that relatively small coalition, that as you said at the start, that relatively thin but very broad coalition that stretches over the UK. He's got to keep that. And so it's not just a question of being boring, it's a question of telling the story, the narrative of what you're trying to achieve. I don't feel like there's a clear story of what's wrong with Britain, other than there was a load of chaotic people who weren't very good. And if we just get non-chaotic people in charge making sensible decisions, then everything will be fine. And that's kind of the optimistic story that I was setting out to you. It's a kind of, if you just do this thing sensibly.
That was his campaign motto, stability is change.
Stability is change, very Orwellian, right? But I just think that's, the danger for them is that they aren't political enough. They have to be political. They have to sell what they're trying to achieve so that people feel that they're going somewhere and that they can back it. And there's a purpose to this. And I think that's what's lost. We're
going to leave it there. We've run out of time. Tom, thank you so much. And thank you for tuning in. To me, that is really the key idea, that although the front pages for the next few days are going to be full of this extraordinary, historic, enormous Labour victory, there is a fragility to this situation. Tinderbox, almost, you could say. The new government is going to be hemmed in. It's going to be very hard for them to do things. They're not necessarily going to have a great time of it in the months or even weeks to come. Stay tuned, we'll be following it, and see you soon. This was UnHerd.